What if you could grow revenue without risk? With the Sift Digital Trust and Safety Suite and our Magento extension, you can. Available now in the Magento marketplace, Sift not only unlocks industry-leading fraud prevention, but fuels hypergrowth. Our real-time machine learning delivers unparalleled accuracy, so you can reduce fraud by 80% or more, even as trends change. Accept more orders, stop fraud, and grow your business in just a few clicks. It's that simple with Sift, the leader in digital trust and safety.
Welcome back to the final talk of the solutions track for Meet Magento New York 2020. Our last speaker today is James Volz. He's product marketing at Sift. And as a product marketer at Sift, James is focused on bringing products to market that promote digital trust and safety, giving companies an edge on fraudsters and competitors. Prior to joining Sift, James did product marketing in the sales enablement software space. So without further ado, James Volz.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm excited to bring this program to a close, hopefully on a topic that you guys find really interesting, digital trust and safety. So as was mentioned, digital trust and safety is something we'll get to a little bit later, and I'm actually going to start by talking about e-commerce growth, because I think, frankly, that's the thing that, no matter what your lens is, brings us to this conference. And to sort of just set the context, I'm going to start with a fact that I hope we all agree on, and it's sort of the existential reason that we're here, which is e-commerce is the way that business is operating, and it's getting more and more so the case. Year over year, we've seen a consistent growth rate of about 13%. But what we're actually seeing is, for the same reason that this conference is online, and basically the rest of our lives are online too, the rate of e-commerce growth has just accelerated. And so while we've seen sort of 13, 14, 15% growth year over year, we're projected to hit around 33% growth in terms of the percentage of commerce that's moving online. And so the point here is that the stakes have never been higher for merchants to get e-commerce right. Basically, the size of the cake is growing faster than we expected, and this is just a huge shift in the trend in the market. IBM just recently did some research about the impact of the pandemic on e-commerce growth and just sort of the maturity of the space, and found that when looking at a couple of factors, like just obviously the amount of revenue moving online, but in addition to that, the maturity of companies and their e-commerce approach, the pandemic has moved the stick forward about 5 years, which is a huge change. I mean, it's sort of like moving from middle school to college, right? And companies have to really, really quickly reevaluate whether the way they're doing things, both from how their site operates, how they're converting, how they're preventing loss, whether this is all moving in lockstep to really position themselves to be winners in this economy. And I think it's more than just revenue moving online. We're also seeing that physical locations, the brick and mortar economy, has contracted significantly, and predictions are that that's sort of going to be a lasting trend. When we look at it from the consumer perspective, there's also been some shifts there. And I think this is something we know intuitively, because we hear over and over again, customer demands are increasing, people expect convenience, et cetera. But with our lives so disrupted, and the fact that we're online for so much of what we do, more customers than ever are shopping in what are called micro moments, meaning, in between meetings, they're jumping in, buying a couple things on Amazon. They're really injecting commerce into their lives in a way that makes it more important than ever that those shopping experiences are fast, convenient, and really personalized for what they need. And so I think, with the landscape so in a flurry, the one thing we can agree on is that where there are goods to be sold, there are also goods to be stolen. And so fraudsters aren't kind of abandoning, crime now that brick and mortar stores are no longer the place where we're spending our time. And so I think with that context set, what we see is that as merchants are moving online, because to the state, still most commerce is brick and mortar. When merchants think about moving online, they really approach fraud prevention online the same way they think about loss prevention in brick and mortar. And what I mean by this is, you have you sell an item, you have what you think are signals that are indicative of fraud. So, in the brick and mortar context, it could be, look suspicious, something tangible, right? But when you think about this online, it's things like order value being high. It's things about expedited shipping that might indicate somebody's trying to get an item out before the chargeback comes in. Basically, it's oriented around what do we think the indicators of fraud are, and how can we build a rule set to stay ahead of that. And based on that, orders come in, go through this rule set, and then based on whether any of those signals match what this preconception of fraud is, there's then action taken on the order or the user. But what we find is that online, more so than in person, there's kind of a disconnect between the intention and the impact of using this approach. And so the hope is that these rules stop fraud and good customers skate through without encountering any friction. In reality, what we find is that, yes, rules can sometimes stop some fraud, but that good customers actually have a lot in common with fraudsters and end up getting impacted by rules. So for example, maybe this trusted customer comes to the site, they ordinarily spend $100, but for whatever reason, their order this time is $300. If that triggers a rule, that's sort of what we call a false positive. It's an unintended impact of the system that actually is well-intentioned, but just isn't well-equipped to solve the issue. And the bigger problem in a lot of cases is that fraudsters they're pretty good at reverse engineering these rules. And so if you build out the perfect rule set, you're stopping all fraud, you're not getting any chargebacks. It's not uncommon for fraudsters to start figuring out, okay, how can I get around this? If I order something for $295 instead of $300, will I be able to get through the rules? And so by using this as sort of the way you approach fraud, not only are you impacting conversion and kind of the experience of your good users, but it's also basically committing yourself to keeping this up on an ongoing basis in order to stay ahead of fraudsters who are really, really motivated to keep finding the way out. And so when we think about this with respect to this rising expectation of consumers for speed, for convenience, for being able to get what they need when they need it, if somebody's shopping between meetings and they really need to order some diapers for their kid and they get some friction on your site, they're not going to hang around. They're going to move to a competitor. They're going to go buy that elsewhere. And so the stakes truly have never been higher to have visibility in the moment of sort of the trustworthiness of an interaction. And so the real tension here is that I think most merchants, SIs in the room, they know that this is the expectation of consumers, right? They know that in order to win in e-commerce, you have to deliver exceptional experiences. And frankly, this is something Magento is really good at, right? They have a lot of tools and capabilities that enable you to customize sites, design these experiences around the way that your users shop. The issue, though, is when we sort of think about what is our approach to preventing loss, what's our approach to fraud prevention, 67%, almost the same percent as say they want to deliver frictionless experiences, say that they know they're blocking good users. They know that their rules are creating false positives, and only 30% know how many, right? But I think what's really striking is there's just this huge execution issue, right? Where 67%, despite well-intentioned, despite the intention to deliver these experiences, just don't have the tools to do so. And so the key, and I should say the key insight here basically is that legacy fraud prevention is not equipped to solve the needs of e-commerce. You can't just think about what is fraud, because when you have so much signal coming in and so much data, what is fraud and what is not fraud based on individual signals just isn't something that you can tease apart. And so the key to bridging this gap is basically to talk about all of this in the same concept, in the same sentence. So on the one hand, we've talked about conversion, growth, that this is really the engine of e-commerce that's going to lead to growth. On the other hand, we have the need to prevent lost inventory, shrinkage, chargeback fees. These aren't separate problems. In fact, they're very related in the sense that when you overachieve on one, it can come at the expense of the other. And so this is really the essence of what the digital trust and safety approach is thinking about, on the one hand, loss prevention and fraud prevention, on the other hand, revenue and conversion, and understanding that it's really one system that ultimately comes down to delivering the right experience at the right time. And so obviously for a fraudster, the right experience is a blocked order. And for a trustworthy user, it might be reducing the friction in the checkout process to help improve conversion. And so the key ingredient that makes this possible that wasn't around in the brick and mortar context is really the volume of data that we can capture about online interactions. Obviously, in the brick and mortar context, you're limited to what you can see, you're limited to what you can hear. Online, users are generating data at every step in the journey. From the moment they log in, we can get information based on their identifiable information, IP address. Once they're on your site, we can get intelligence from their behavior and from the way that they're browsing the site. And we obviously get information based on how they're paying, whether they're using promotions, where things are being shipped. At every moment in the journey, there's data that we can take advantage of to help predict who is likely to be a trustworthy user and who's likely to be a fraudster. And so the premise here is really not only is there more data available than ever before, but because it's being produced from the moment they hit your site, you can be more proactive. You don't have to wait until they get to the order and run some checks on a couple of fields using a rule set. It's really more than about the data itself, too. Sift is a machine learning company, and so one of the benefits of using algorithms is that you can extract even deeper signal from the data that you have. So obviously we have all this rich data. When you input it into machine learning, we begin to extract even deeper meaning from it. So instead of just saying, is this email address from a domain that we have gotten hit with fraud with in the past, we look at things like, what is the composition of the email? Does the name in the email relate to the name on the shipping address? What is the email domain reputation, generally speaking, not just what is its reputation with your business. And so the idea here is that there's a lot to learn, not just from the signals themselves, but from how they're composed, basically the pieces within them that we just can't intuit as people. And when we expand this even further to looking at just all the signals that we have available, we talked about, looking at an email address and a shipping address. But to the slide about how users are generating so much data, we have a device fingerprint. We have information about their browsing activity. We have information about their locations. Not only that, but we also have data from across the internet, right? In our case, across Sift customers, but shared intelligence about what signals have been known to be fraudulent, what signals are trustworthy. And we give you that information in this holistic measure. The benefit of this, again, is when you look at all of this consolidated into a metric rather than in individual pieces, it really gives you the power to say, okay, I recognize that my trustworthy users and my fraudsters are going to be sharing signals, but there are still going to be significant deviations in what those signals look like as groups, right? And so what machine learning does is it lets you tease those apart. Instead of looking just at an email domain, it says what set of signals is something that I can really make an accurate risk assessment on. And that's really what the boost of accuracy from machine learning comes from this holistic assessment. And so when we think about the value of this holistic assessment, it's not just in the fact that this number captures so much information. It's also in that you can take action on it in much more flexible ways than you can with rules. So when you're running rules at the point of an order, you're basically saying, do any of these rules do any of these criteria that I think are important get hit? When you're automating based on machine learning throughout the user journey, you can say, okay, let's get this holistic measure of risk. And based on this holistic assessment, what is the right experience for the user at each step in the journey? And so what we're looking at here is what might be a pretty common flow for an e-commerce customer coming to your site, right? They log in. It's a low risk assessment. They're allowed to go browse your store, add an item to their cart. And because they're not raising any red flags, we're going to accept their order with no friction. When we identify based on signal extraction, based on our machine learning, that there is something suspicious happening, what we can do is the same way we kind of kept the good user moving, we can apply additional layers of what we call dynamic friction based on this real-time risk assessment. And so if an account is created and there's some suspicious attributes about the identity or about the card they're using, we can use those signals as opportunities to challenge them and maybe stop the fraud before they actually get to the point of adding orders to their queue and committing fraud. Likewise, once somebody is an established user on their site, and if we notice deviations in their behavior, we can also go in and apply friction at that point to prevent an account takeover type incident. And so when we think about the joint value of this sort of approach to what Magento offers, it's really, really straightforward, because I think the digital trust and safety approach and what Magento brings to the table are very, very similar. Magento, as I mentioned, is really the best in the market at delivering a platform that enables SIs, merchants, to unlock engaging shopping experiences, right? They give you the engine to power your e-commerce business. What Sift provides is the most accurate risk assessments for every user interaction. These are both, think about them as sort of flexible tools, right? Magento can basically do whatever you want from the perspective of building out your e-commerce presence. Sift can basically do whatever you want when it comes to applying risk assessments to tailor the user journey. And we're really excited to have just recently announced an integration that provides merchants and SIs a low-code way to basically take what Sift has built in terms of this digital trust and safety solution and put it into practice in Magento easier than ever before. And so just to give you a snapshot of what this looks like, really it comes down to integrating some snippets on web pages and plugging in API keys. This is probably a site familiar to most of you. You enter the API keys within the Sift dashboard of Magento. And basically, once you run some tests in Sandbox, you can get up and running very, very quickly. And to give you a sense of what this looks like from a user flow perspective, let's say I'm a user, I'm coming on this Luma site to buy a backpack. You can see here, I'm new on the site, there's not really much about me that's suspicious, and so my score with Sift is a 20. Maybe I decide, oh, that driven backpack looks pretty cool. So I click on that, I'm looking at it, I add it to my cart, and for whatever reason, my score doesn't go up much. The system notices something that is slightly different, but still very low risk, and I'm able to proceed through the transaction with little to no friction at all. From there, Sift would approve the transaction, send a webhook back into Magento, and the order would be approved and show up in your orders dashboard just like any other order. You can see here the accepted decision. But then let's talk about the other case. So obviously the goal of a digital trust and safety solution is to sort of provide the right experience at the right time, which sometimes means applying additional layers of friction. So let's say, for example, I'm a less trustworthy user. I do the same thing. I'm on the main page. I decide, I'm going to get the driven backpack. Maybe this is an account I've created with a new email address. So an email address that doesn't have a lot of history. It was just created maybe a couple of days ago. Maybe my IP is in a risky location. These are things that in a rule system might be enough to trigger a block type event, block order, block the user, etc. But because these are being factored in with everything else that's part of our risk assessment, this isn't something that's stopping this user from progressing. So the score here elevates to 40, but I'm allowed to add it to my cart. I add it to my cart. And then we're noticing a couple of other signals that are kind of increasing the risk, meaning the way I'm browsing is a little bit suspicious. And there's also a mismatch between the shipping address and the billing address. In combination, these are contributing to a score of 60, which, based on the logic we've set up for manual review, is sending this order into a queue. And so with Sift, we don't give you just the score. That is like the primary the thing we deliver that I would say is the most important, right? That's what's ultimately enabling you to execute on this. But we also offer a UI to enable you to accomplish the operational side of digital trust and safety, setting up automation, reviewing orders as they come in, et cetera. And so from that decision, we're going to be able to access that order within a Sift queue. And when we open it up, we're seeing here, this is the order with a score of 60, has a risky email address, has a risky billing address, there's a mismatch. Basically, the Sift console peels back what the machine learning is doing in order to give you visibility into why we think this is a risky order or not. And so as a team, if you have in-house review as a function, or whether you outsource this to other places, you're able to really, really quickly make these decisions and make the right decision by customers. And so the thing I really want to highlight is why do we think that this is the right approach, right? Why do we think that digital trust and safety is the way of the future and the way that e-commerce needs to be thinking about fraud prevention? So we did some research at Sift looking at what the fastest growing e-commerce companies have in common. This was based on data from the Internet Retailer Database, so the top 1,000 internet retailers by revenue. And what we looked for was, what do the top growing companies have in common? And what we found is when we did some research into some of these top performing companies, Harry's, HelloFresh, Stitch Fix, Wayfair are just a couple of examples. They really adhered to this digital trust and safety approach, both in terms of how they made trade-off decisions when they're thinking about revenue generation and loss prevention, how they structure these teams internally. There's oftentimes stakeholders who have shared objectives to make sure that the way that they're addressing loss prevention is in harmony with the way they're thinking about their conversion and revenue creation objectives. So there's really a strong correlation here between a company approaching these issues in a way that is cohesive and how you perform relative to peers. And yeah, that's really what I wanted to cover. Would love to turn to any questions that have come in at this point.
So if you do have questions, feel free to post them in the chat, or there's a Q&A tab. Any questions that pop up, I will be sure to relay them to James. As soon as I say that, one pops up. Hold on 1 second. Where did it go? Oh my God. It's been doing this to me all day.
So even Microsoft Teams is tired.
Yeah.
Done good.
The Q&A tab just like says there's a question and it just goes missing. And while we wait for that to catch up to reality, I had one question about the fraud section. Is when you say you use machine learning and to do it'd be filtering really. How, in your experience working in this field, how much has AI/machine learning encroached into the algorithms that you usually used in the last few years? Like,
so you're saying how
how much more have you found, at least yourselves, relying on machine learning as opposed to in the past?
Mm-hmm. So I think, so Sift was founded in 2011 as a machine learning company. And the mission of our founder was really to take technology that was being used by the biggest names in tech at that time already. So things like Google, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera. They've been using AI and ML to power these kinds of processes for a long time. So the mission of our founder was really to take this technology and open it up to other kinds of merchants. And so I think in terms of how we've seen this being adopted, to sort of the slide about how this is correlated with growth, I think what we've seen is that the companies that have started to adopt this mindset and this approach are seeing the strongest growth. And that as companies, become Sift partners or start to use ML that they build, whatever their approach is, we see that, operational costs go down, false positives go down, fraud catch rate goes up. So there's, when you're talking about the e-commerce context, there's just a fundamental advantage to machine learning over this rules-based approach. The one thing I would say is that there are obviously cases where there are hard and fast business policies that need to be enforced, right? So a machine will never know, my boss said any order over $500, we always got to look at. That's a case where you will have to put some criteria in place to define what the right action is. But when it comes to detecting kind of the changing fraud patterns, this sort of adversarial thing that fraud teams get into with criminals, there's really nothing better than machine learning because it's far faster than what we can do as people. And so I think what the interesting thing is we're going to see more of this over time, but there's kind of a machine learning warfare that will occur where obviously fraud teams are using machine learning. Soon fraudsters are going to start using machine learning and sort of, there's going to be a lot of evolution in the space as that becomes the case.
So I'm guessing you're saying you expect it to be an evolving arms race and something that'll keep you busy for a long time.
For sure. And I think it always has been too, right?
Yeah.
It's always kind of a tit for tat. We're going to put in more security cameras. We're going to, hide things from the cameras in a different way. It's the same thing online. As soon as you put in a new countermeasure, people are going to try a different approach to accomplish the same end. And so, yeah, I think the arms race is a good metaphor for how fraud prevention works in general.
Very cool. That red dot that showed up in questions seems to have been a bug, because that question never showed up again.
Maybe it heard the one in your head.
Yeah.
Prompt.
So I guess if there is no questions, if you're viewing, you have about 30 seconds to pop me a question or write something in chat. I guess we'll tie up here for now. A couple housekeeping things. This is the last event. So there's the last talk on the solutions track. So if you would like, there is a bunch of people chatting on the lounge. I'd encourage you to spend the last half an hour hanging out with people on the lounge. That's where I'm headed to. Also, our previous speaker to James Volz was from Taxture, and they're a sponsor. So feel free to hop over to the sponsors booth, and if you click on the little Taxture logo, you'll be able to chat with possibly Michael if you had questions for him. Is Sift a sponsor also? No, I don't believe so.
I'm not.
Yes.
I think we do. Yeah, we do have a booth, and so there
Sift
might be an opportunity to flip over there too for some questions.
Yeah, Sift is a platinum sponsor also, so feel free to, if you do have questions you want to ask to James directly without me trying to interpret it. I'm sure if you head over to the Sift booth on the sponsor section, you'd be able to get those questions across to him directly.
Definitely, yeah. And also, if you have any questions that come up later on, would encourage you to check out sift.com/Magento for an overview of kind of what our solution looks like for Magento specifically in a little more detail. And then there's an email there if you want to outreach a little later on. So
yeah, for sure. Well, thank you all for viewing. Thank you, James, for the excellent presentation. And I guess I'll see you all in the lounge.
Thank you.